Welcome to the Ascension of the Chessmen podcast. I'm your host, Andre Mitty. Today's guest is a philosopher, alchemist, herbalist, and host of the Alchemiculture podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, hobbits and fairies, give a warm welcome to Phoenix Aurelius.
Thanks for having me on, brother.
Oh, thank you for coming on, brother. I'm so happy to have you. And my first question for every guest is always, for those who aren't familiar, can you please explain what it is that you do and what woke you up to realizing maybe there's more to this life than you originally taught or thought?
Sure, yeah, man. So I guess for those that are listening or watching that aren't familiar with my work, basically what I have done for the almost past 20 years now is teach and create spagyrics, which spagyria is like an entire branch of alchemy that focuses on the medical applications of alchemical substances. And I run the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, where basically I make, create, and then perform modern day quantum scalar analytics on all of the different products that I make and then test them in a clinical environment to be able to see, do these products that have their history in the past have modern day ramifications? And the very short answer to that is, oh, hell yes. And in my personal opinion, we need to get back to that because pharmaceutical medicine was essentially born out of this style of pharmacopoeia, but it bastardized it in so many different ways. It lost the soul and the spirit of the medicine. And so that's pretty much what I do. And then the second part to your question was basically like what first led me down the path that like there's more to this existence than what we initially thought. That for me was psychedelic mushrooms, actually. Cannabis and then psychedelic mushrooms, and in that order. And
very similar to me.
yeah, exactly. It got me really thinking. I was training to become a priest within the Catholic faith when I was like 15 years old, and had a friend named Joe who got me into smoking some cannabis, and that kind of like opened up my mind and got me, connecting with plants in a very, very interesting way, where I was having like dialogues within my head with these plants. And then he said, if you think that's really cool and open you up, you should consider psychedelic mushrooms. So we sat down and had psychedelic mushrooms, and that blew the lid, because I had this, huge one-on-one with what I perceived to be God at the time. And it's like, dude, you're looking in all the wrong places. Like you have to like focus on energy. And ever after that, my life just completely changed. I focused very, very heavily on understanding energy in all of its different facets and being very open, skeptical, but still open to all different types of experiences. And it's through that skepticism that I've developed a sense of discretion to try and determine scientifically, what can I show, what can I demonstrate, what can I experience, versus just like believe what I'm told. So
right. Yeah. Wow, that's crazy, man. It's crazy, like someone like yourself, I've listened to many of your shows, many of your appearances, and like, just the commonalities like you have with, some of the people that, you never meet, and then you meet them, you're like, holy shit, like we have more in common than you would think. And
dude, it's true.
I grew up Catholic, and like, man, that was a very similar story to my own as far as like, my quote unquote awakening or, broader perspective. I guess my question on that is like, was your friend training to be a priest as well, or was he taking a different path?
No, he was also Catholic, but that was actually just a coincidence.
Okay.
I never even seen him at our parish. So no, he had nothing to do with going down the path of being clergy member. He was like as distant actually from church related stuff as you could get. He was, what we call the Common Core Catholic, which would basically indicate that he went to mass on Easter and Christmas Eve,
a couple times a year.
Yeah, exactly. So
I wear the hat when I need to.
Yeah, exactly. That's definitely where he was. I don't think if you said, hey Joe, recite the Apostles' Creed, I'm pretty sure he would not have even known, how to do that, or, let alone the Lord's Prayer, probably even. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. it's funny because like it just made me ponder like, is there like a sect of priests out there who are like dabble with mushrooms and explore what's beyond as they're taking that vow of
Yeah.
holiness and everything. And
Yeah, doing their holy orders. You know, I personally think that there probably are. Okay, so I mean, let's go back to the Middle Ages.
right.
Most of the brothers who were parts of various different orders, of monastic life, that's commonly what they were doing. They were brewing their own ales with herbs that did not include hops at that time, which would have, in some cases, provided psychedelic effects to it. Especially in Norse territories, they would have been doing that because they had been brewing ale and mead with mushrooms for hundreds of years already by the time Christianity was introduced to them. So I think that even if there aren't that many who are, publicly doing these things today,
Right.
I think that the history is there, and I bet you that there are more than what you might experience, or what you might think, who are having these types of experiences. What I meant to say.
For sure.
So yeah, yeah, it always gets me scratching my head and wondering, because every once in a
Right.
while you'll get like this oddball priest, who's just like super enlightened, way beyond the structure of the confines of an organized religion. It's like,
Right.
how/why are you still doing this? But everybody's got their calling, everybody's got their thing. So
For sure. I was on a flight back from Florida. I was volunteering at a ayahuasca church down in Florida, and I was sitting next to a guy on the plane who had just left the seminary, and he was gonna be a priest, but he decided it wasn't for him or whatever. And we had a talk the whole way back, like for 2 hours. And there's another guy who was a pro skateboarder, like sitting next to me on the other side. And all three of us were just talking philosophy, spirituality, psychedelics, and all this stuff. And like, it was just mind blowing. Like, I had never, like, it'd been a while at least that I had like sat down and like, stumbled upon this like enlightening conversation just on an
yeah.
airplane.
Yeah, seriously, that's a rarity. The fact that you're even talking to people on an airplane is
Right.
actually somewhat of an odd occurrence these days.
Exactly. So yeah, that just kind of brought up that for me. But um, so I guess how did you get into spagyria and the impact it's had on your life? And if you could just go into detail what it entails for those unfamiliar, I guess that you haven't already went into.
Sure, yeah. So part one, I got into spagyria by fate and fortune. I was not only training to become a priest, but I was a skateboarder, and I really wanted to become a pro skateboarder.
Mhm.
So it was on my brother's birthday, March 1st. I can't remember what year. I remember I was 16. There's what, 7.5 years difference between us. So he must have been turning, like 8 or something like that. Um, at any rate, there was this quarter pipe that led to a kicker. I went off of it and fell straight through the foam pit onto my left ankle with all my force and dislocated my ankle. And so I couldn't skateboard for a while, but I still, I healed really fast even then. And so 30 days later, I went back out just trying to do some very simple things, and dislocated it again because it still wasn't fully healed. And then, yeah, I still didn't learn my lesson. It takes sometimes, instances of threes in order for a person to learn. At least that's my experience. And I'll tell you what, I did it again 30 days after that. So within a 90-day period, I had dislocated my ankle 3 times, and the doctors were like, dude, you're never going to skateboard again, let alone even walk right, if you don't let this heal. Like, this is a big deal. So they set it back into place and sent me home. And I finally listened to them that time. And I got off my skateboard. And after I healed, it took about 90 days. I just started taking walks up in the mountains. So, I live here in Utah. I grew up in this little town called Layton. And there's this really enchanting spot up in the mountains with tons of creeks and spring water and all these wild foods and herbs and stuff, and a big castle. Actually, like I'm this major medieval and kind of Renaissance enthusiast, and so the fact that there's this huge castle right at the base of this place called Fernwood Forest, just like it was my favorite place ever. And I only lived, just you could virtually throw a stone and hit it from where I live. So I would constantly go up there and just go on hikes in the hills and smoke some cannabis and start connecting with the plants. And I was still in high school at the time. Like I said, I was 16. I just transferred from Catholic school to public school, though, so I had tons of extra credits. One day I went in the computer lab, and this was still in the days where like Yahoo was the major major search engine. It was about 2003 or something like that. And I printed off a forum on how to make a spagyric tincture. And I really didn't know what a spagyric tincture was. I didn't know what spagyric meant. I was just barely kind of getting into a lot of different herbalism practices, but it was one of the ones that I printed off and I really liked the procedure and it seemed more involved than the others. And when I made common herbal tinctures versus this spagyric method, it was like a world of difference. And so for me, I just kept making these spagyric tinctures. And it wasn't until a couple of years later when a friend of mine named Janine, who is now passed, she ended up telling me, she was an herbalist for many years, and she was like, dude, why are your tinctures so much more potent than mine? And I said, let's go out to lunch and compare notes. And we did. And she said, man, you're doing spagyrics. That's part of the alchemical tradition. You know that? I said, no. And she said, well, the largest alchemical school was run right here in Salt Lake City, and it still might be going. And I searched, and it turns out it closed 2 years before I was even born. But a lot of the students were still around. And so from that time forward, is like 2004, 2005-ish, I dedicated my life to trying to find those students and doing everything that I could that was alchemical. So I was making some tinctures, some spagyric tinctures and stuff. I wouldn't really call that a lot of lab work though, because like my crucibles, which is what we burn things in, they were just stolen stainless steel condiment containers from our local diner.
Oh yeah.
Like my flasks were just mason jars, things like that. So I never really said that I was doing lab work at that time,
Right.
but I got really
working with what you had,
I was
essentially.
working totally with what I had.
Yeah.
And I remember like the first still that I put together, I bought a stainless steel teapot and a cork, like just a standard cork that would fit in the end of that teapot. And then I bored a hole inside of there and got some copper tubing that would stick out and wrapped it around in the circle and stuck it in like all janky style into a 2-liter bottle. Like all of my days of making, impromptu bongs really came in handy at that point because I was able to, do the old lighter trick on the plastic bottle and get it to sear just enough that I was able to stick the thing through and take some chewing gum and seal it up so that it would hold some water. And then ran it over a fire. And the first herb that I distilled was yarrow, and the essential oil came out blue and it's floating on the water, just like, coming out blue. And my mind was blown and I was just hooked, man. I was just hooked at that point. And I just knew like, this alchemy thing, I'm hooked on it forever. And so yeah, very humble beginnings in that way. Like all of my herbs, like I said, were started in mason jars, and all of my tinctures, like I had to have my friends go to the liquor store for me and buy me those little 200 ml bottles of Everclear and stuff like that in order to be able to even practice. But that's how I did it for many years until I could afford labware. And then progressively it just got deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and I've never lost interest. I still haven't lost interest, and there's still more for me to do than I could ever possibly hope to do in a single lifetime. So that's kind of that. So
Wow.
so
Yeah, that's
yeah, dude, it was just like I said, it was kind of fate and fortune. I ended up inheriting a lot of laboratory ware from Frater Albertus. He ran that big alchemy school that was here in Utah. It was called the Paracelsus Research Society. And Frater Albertus's secretary was in her 80s, and this was like 2009 or so. She was in her 80s, and she says she puts out this thing to the International Alchemy Guild Bulletin saying, hey, I'm giving away a lot of labware or selling it. Contact me if you're interested. And I was sitting at the email or at the computer when that email came through. So I contacted her and I went to visit her, and she said, you remind me a lot of Frater. you definitely have his spirit. So she ended up gifting me like enormous amounts of books, many of which are on the library shelves behind me, and then a lot of labware too, including some of Frater Albertus's own gloves, asbestos heat gloves, heat-proof gloves,
Wow.
and a number of other things. So things just kind of came to me once I put it in the flow. I have handwritten notes from very famous students of Frater Albertus's, including Israel Regardi, on lab work. I also have, other different types of materials too, handwritten notes from Frater Albertus to Viola, who is the person I inherited this stuff from, about various lab operations, and little bits that were highlighted in some of the books that she gave me with her own personal notes. It kind of reminds me of in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, where he's reading through the Half-Blood Prince. There's all these notes, that Snape
Right.
had put in there about, here's how to do it properly. Like it literally fast tracked my
Wow.
understanding, my practice, just like crazy. So yeah, fate and fortune, man. That's how
Right.
I got into it.
So much synchronicity going on there. Like my question, so you said this was the only alchemical college in the US at the time, or was there other
Yeah,
ones?
up until he died, like there was nobody really teaching alchemy at the time that he was. So before he started the Paracelsus Research Society, they did have alchemy courses in San Jose, California, at
Mm,
Rosicrucian Park, and
okay.
I think the guy's name was Orson Graves, who was teaching those courses. And after Orson died, things kind of fizzled out. Frater taught a couple of classes. I think one or two other people kind of taught a few other classes. Then it fizzled out. So Frater was Mormon. He was from Austria initially, but he was a Mormon convert. And so he married this nice Mormon girl, moved to Salt Lake City, and then ended up advertising in the Rosicrucian Journal
Mm,
that he was now teaching alchemy classes to fill this void that they had had by no longer teaching their own classes in San Jose. So people came from all over the country to come and teach. He also taught in Austria. He also taught in Australia and in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. And so he had quite an expansive reach, actually, in terms of the people that he taught. But yeah, after he died, in the early, maybe it was late 80s, like 1989, 1990, a new organization, one that was initially based out of France, ended up coming to rise, and that was called the Philosophers of Nature. And Viola, Frater Albertus' secretary, also was involved very heavily in those courses. So I inherited almost all of those too, including all of the notes to the weekend seminars that they held, and all of the transcripts and everything. And just so happened that they ended up actually filming things on VHS back in the day. And it was maybe around 2010 to 12 or something like that. There was a company called Triad Publishing, put out by Russ and Sue House, and they converted a lot of those VHS things to DVD, and so I have those now too. So I can actually watch the same classes, and I can actually see Viola in class, like raising her hand and asking questions, and then I've got her notes here
right.
on the back end of what she wrote
Wow.
down to those questions. It's cool, man.
It's like taking yourself back in time in a sense, like retaking those classes. That's crazy.
Oh, totally, totally. Yeah, those.
That's mind blowing, man. Like the fact that this college happened to be where you were at, like, and this is what you were just getting, like, so much synchronicity there, man. And like you said,
Oh
just
yeah,
plain fate. Like that's a miracle, man.
man. Well, it goes even one step further, actually, too, because in 2007, that was the first international alchemy conference. Okay, so there's this guy, God, I forget his name. He was an Austrian fellow. His name's not important, but he died. Hans Schimmer, I think, was his name. But he died, and Dennis William Hauck ended up inheriting basically the role of president of the International Alchemy Guild. And Dennis was like, we've got to create conferences. We have to create these international conferences. So he created them in 2007, 2008, and they were held in Las Vegas, Nevada, which for me, that's like a $75 flight still today to get there and
Right.
back. It's
Right.
super cheap. So my friend and I end up going down in 2007, and I can't remember if it's 2007. I remember most of Frater Albertus's living students were there in 2007, but in 2008, all of them were, all of the living ones, they were invited as like guests of honor.
Oh, wow.
And so I got to meet tons of them. And then in 2009, I got to meet Frater Albertus's daughter, whose name is Angela. And they gave me tons of materials too, because I told them what had happened, and they were like, "Oh, you know Viola? Oh, you're doing this. Oh, wow!" And so they ended up giving me copies of the Essentia magazines and all these other publications that Frater had put out. And so I just was really connected in with people who had been at that point practicing for, over 35 years at least, some of them for 50 or more years. And it was just so amazing to be able to have that type of community, especially of elders who
Yeah.
were able to kind of, be like, hey, when you do this, do it like this, or, there's this new piece of labware that will make it easier than if you use what labware they were exposing in those diagrams because they wrote them 25 years ago. And it made everything so much easier and so much faster for me.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It was like a shortcut. Like
Yes.
that's, man, that whole tale you told is just mind blowing to me, like how that all came together. But it says the
Yeah.
magic of the universe we're living in completely.
Yeah, exactly. When that's your path, man, and you stay on the path, I think, other people have really amazing tales about how they got into what they're doing and other things too. And
Right.
I think it has something to do with like, is what you're doing what you're meant to be doing, and are you really seeking it out consciously? Because if so, like the universe conspires in your favor. And
Yeah.
that definitely seems to be my experience. So
100%, brother. That's amazing. And um, you know, like I said, I was diving back into Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings of the Ages, and he goes on to say alchemy is one of the two oldest sciences known to the world, the other being astrology. Um, as these were considered divinely revealed to man, so that by their aid might might he regain his lost estate. I guess,
mhm.
what are your thoughts on astrology and how you use or apply it to your life?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I have to start just by saying that the Hermetic Sciences, which basically the Greeks defined one of the Egyptian pharaohs as Hermes II, and they said that he was basically the living incarnation of the Greek god Hermes, and that's where our term Hermetic comes from. So, of the Hermetic Sciences, there's three branches. There's alchemy, astrology, and some would call it magic, including myself. Others would call it
Mhm,
Kabbalah. The
mhm.
two are really indistinguishable at a certain point. But yeah, so astrology, alchemy, and Kabbalah or magic all go hand in hand, and they're basically just different applications of the same thing. So, whereas alchemy deals on a very microcosmic level, like we observe nature, we work with things, and then we demonstrate the physicality of it on a microcosmic level inside of the lab to see if we can trigger the same types of evolution in a shorter period of time as what nature herself can. um, Astrology is that same thing, just on a macrocosmic level. And so we're constantly evolving as a result of the cosmos. If you think about Carl Sagan, I'm writing a peer-reviewed paper with Dr. Debasish Kumdu right now, and this is in there. I always draw back to Carl Sagan. He
Yeah.
says, billions of years ago, stars explode, and the iron in our blood, the calcium in our teeth and bones, all of this originated with those first primordial explosions that create these stars. And then he says in his very archetypal way, we are star stuff.
Yes.
And what I think is really important about that is that when you take a look at all of the stars that surround us on the ecliptic in particular, which are what most people would refer to as the zodiac, these are the cardinal directions around the earth: the north, the south, the east, the west, the above, the below. Those are it's like a three-dimensional axis basically all the way around us that point out all of the directions that things can evolve in over a period of time. And it's very circular, but every, how do I explain this eloquently? It's basically that, you know, even though Aries is one sign and eventually you make your way through the whole zodiac back to Aries, the entire evolutionary scale that happens in that 26,000 year or so period known as the precession of the equinoxes, it actually has patterns to it, so that the life forms are going to be much more evolved, but they're going to go through the same types of archetypal evolution. So the same processes are evolved, just to a more advanced form of creation. And this is constantly happening. And we can see this happening. We can chart it out even within what we now understand archaeologically, from prehistory, and also anthropologically, just within the course of slight prehistory and recorded history as we know it here on Earth. You can see these patterns very clearly playing out. And so when you understand that patterns are at play on a very large scale with the precession of the equinoxes, it also happens on a much smaller scale within just a single solar or lunar year. And it also happens in a much smaller scale with the monthly cycle of the moon as well. And so you begin to see, and then each of the planets around us also have these things. So from my perspective, you know, the way that it works is very electromagnetic in its origin. You know, Earth has a
Yes.
strong magnetosphere and electromagnetic field. And what ends up happening is that if a certain planet is closer to us, especially say Jupiter, that has this huge magnetosphere, it impacts our magnetosphere. And magnetism and electromagnetism actually impact our perception of time. They impact our perception of space. They distort the field in one way or another that actually changes the electromagnetic and electrochemical relationship between all living things that are part of that Earth whose field is being distorted. And so I think that given enough time, we'll be able to very scientifically see and understand, oh, these types of fluctuations create these types of neurotransmitter and hormonal changes inside of people individually and collectively based on their proximity to the area that is being distorted of the Earth's field, and creating this type of archetypal, shall we say, behavior inside of individuals. And that's what I think we'll end up seeing over time. So to me, astrology is really just a study of archetypal forces that are at play for the collective evolution and individual evolution of various species, depending on their proximity to the location of distortion.
That was a beautiful explanation, brother. Thank you for that. And
Yeah.
you know, it's kind of like how they say, like, you know, astronomy came from astrology. Do you feel like chemistry came from alchemy?
Yeah, well, that latter statement is definitely a proven fact. Chemistry it did get born out of alchemy. In fact, the guy that created spagyria, his name was Paracelsus. He was around from, like, I want to say his birth date was like in the 1490s, and he died in the 1540s by blunt force trauma. By the way, they pounded him in the back of the head, smashed his skull in. But he basically created an entire corpus of medicine and a style of chemistry and language to it. That was the biggest thing that he really contributed, was a context of language, common core language that could be used. And it got, over the next couple hundred years, adapted so that by the time we get to Johann von Helmont, Johann Baptist von Helmont, he writes this book called The Skeptical Chemist, which is basically like, yeah, I know what Paracelsus is saying about these various chemicals of sulfur, mercury, and salt, but if I extract this salt with acetic acid versus water, I get two different products, and we're still just calling a salt of salt. He's like, I think they're two different things entirely. So I don't necessarily think that there are just four elements of fire, air, water, and earth, and three philosophic principles of sulfur, mercury, and salt. We've got to open this up. And those are the types of evolutionary ideas that ultimately led into alchemy, turning into chemistry. And so it was a very gradual thing and a very necessary thing, actually, because the old literature, especially the kind of Middle Age and Renaissance literature from Europe, is very, very obscure in the way that you read it, not just because sometimes they were trying to make things obscure so that other people, the uninitiated, so to speak, wouldn't just reproduce their projects and gain, all sorts of riches or whatever. It had less to do with that. It had more to do with the limitations of terminology and common core terminology. And so you have to kind of know what it is that they're doing. And then they would give like very cryptic names to things because that's just the way that they saw it. So like if something was green and it was able to dissolve another substance, then they might illustrate that as a green lion swallowing the sun, devouring the sun being gold, and this green substance being the thing that is able to dissolve that gold. And so you would get, various imagery like that, and it was not consistent among all of the different alchemists, but they would still refer to, say, a green lion or a black dragon or any of these other things, but they were talking about two entirely different processes, two entirely different substances. And this is what led later folks like Carl Jung to make gross errors in his assumptions of the alchemists not only working maybe with chemical materials, but trying to disguise spiritual or psychological concepts as well. Really, it's all in one, because as you're working on the materials are working on you. And they open up new psychological processes because you're watching nature's evolution on a microcosmic scale. You're watching it happen almost like in time lapse, based on the way that nature works in comparison to how fast our lab works. And so you're able to see these things, and just the realizations and the awareness of what is happening, it ends up penetrating into your subconscious and permeating into your entire being. And this is always kind of like what I say, and even what a lot of studies have kind of confirmed are the same, is that what you watch and what you surround yourself with, the input that you have, has a huge effect on the output of your own life. It changes you and shapes you with a certain type of programming. And so when you're huddled in your laboratory just watching all these things evolve, you tend to evolve very, very, very quickly as an individual. But so back to chemistry, though, it was definitely born out of alchemy, and it was something that was an absolute necessity. And now we're in this really cool time where we can reconcile the alchemical processes with all of the new scientific names and terminology that exists, so that there is not so much confusion. We have an even more precise way of relating about to materials and talking about the different processes and what is made from those processes in a way that we've never had access to before. So if we can marry chemistry back into alchemy, which is a big part of my work, then I think that we're going to be headed towards a golden age pretty quickly, maybe 100 years or less.
Oh yeah. And I got a brother that's a chemical engineer, and we're very different people. And I think he thinks I'm crazy in a lot of senses, but he's really into Jeopardy, and he was at like this Jeopardy game night or whatever, and he said the one question he couldn't answer, the answer was alchemy. And I got the answer. I was like, yeah, it's alchemy. And and he didn't know what alchemy was, and I was like,
irony of that.
I was like, that's so ironic. I was like, this would be right up your alley. Like, this is what I want you to get into. But seriously. Yeah, I mean, I really would love to get him into your work and the stuff you're doing, because I think it would be revolutionary for his understanding of what he already understands from the chemistry aspect. And
yeah,
I feel like there's just something missing without it.
Yeah, it's totally true. In fact, 2/3 of the art are really missing in modern day chemistry, because they took the soul and they took the spirit out of everything. So the soul meaning the psychological component. So you see, like even in Nightmare Before Christmas, you know, Jack Skellington is in his laboratory and he's seeing things and he makes something glow and he's asked himself, but what does it mean? Right.
Yeah.
That is a very archetypal way of looking at things from an alchemical perspective, because yeah, of course you can force any sort of chemical manipulation you want with acid-base reactions or even more complex chemical reactions that you might want. But what does it actually signify? What is the corollary to the psychological transformation that is happening? You just transformed a substance from two different things into something new that is neither this nor that, but something that is born out of those two things in a new way that didn't exist before. So what does that correspond to internally? And they're just not paying attention to that. And the other part is the spiritual ramification of it, which is to say, how does this increase our capacity to be more at unity with nature and with our fellow individuals? Because at the end of the day, if the work that you're doing in the laboratory, if you say that you're practicing alchemy and your work isn't doing that thing, helping you connect deeper with your neighbors and with the world at large and developing a greater sense of understanding and compassion and, you know, all these things, you're really not practicing alchemy just as much as you're practicing base chemistry. You know.
Right.
So yeah, I think that those two things are absolutely critical for most chemical engineers and chemists just in general to really start thinking about, because they've already got a really good handle in most ways on the chemistry and the lab work and the familiarity with lab work. In fact, they might even find some of the work that we're doing really fascinating because of the vast types of chemical reactions that happen, especially within spagyria, that you don't get to see inside of a standard chemistry laboratory, because they're working with isolates already. And when you work with plants, it's anything but an isolate. You have so many different phytochemicals that you're working with. It's a really rich series of reactions that happen. And from a chemical perspective, that's really cool and really awesome to behold. So you know, I have people step into my lab all the time. You know, they always ask me like, wow, how'd you get into chemistry? I said, I've never taken a day of chemistry in my life. Everything that I have learned has actually been alchemy based in the modern age. So it's accompanied by chemical terms. And so I can show you exactly what's going on. And in some cases, I've even had to learn the chemical language of today so that I can relate to modern people about what is happening. But I view it all from the perspective of an alchemist, and they're just blown away, because they're like, man, this is some of the most advanced stuff. This is what I wanted my chemistry classes to be when I got into this field. And it's just, you know, monotonous on a day-to-day for them. So yeah,
I was bored to death with chemistry class.
Oh, it's all equations and shit.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
So
yeah, and you know, I had the discussion with my brother as well, like, you know, being in that realm of, you know, very materialistic science, like because he's still a Catholic, and you know, just being surrounded by, because there's a lot of atheist undertones, or like, this is all meaningless, or you know, we have no purpose, like we have it all figured out, like, and you know, I just kind of asked him, like, what's it like being surrounded by that? And, you know, do you get a lot of peer pressure or made fun of because you still have a belief in something greater than yourself, like, while, you know, practicing under this umbrella of material science, you know? And
what was his answer to that?
He said, you know, the way I see it, I have nothing to lose if it doesn't exist. Like, if I die and I don't go to heaven, like, I have nothing to lose, but I have everything to gain if I do believe it. And he said, if I don't believe it, I have everything to lose. Like, I don't gain anything, and I don't like, I'm already losing either way. So well, which I understood.
That's a safe perspective to take. You can't blame somebody for thinking in that way. That's a very safe perspective to take. So, you know, hats off to him.
Yeah.
But at the same time, in all modern day sciences, it tends to be very nihilistic view. The exception to that is kind of astrophysics,
Mm,
and quantum physics,
right.
because they're starting to see that there's a lot more to the universe that makes things tick than what we think. And in fact, you know, it's not just even ticking from a biomechanical view. It's like there's so much, like how does the energy even get created in order to, you know, make the battery that funds the whole ticking process of the gears. uh you know,
Yeah.
that it gets really deep. And so yeah, I think that most fields of science though are just very nihilistic in that way, in that there's no reason to look at anything beyond uh the physical. And
Right.
what a dull world. It's like seeing things in a single dimension instead of a three-dimensional field, you know. It's
Right. You're not
that's
seeing the
kind of,
full spectrum.
yeah. So that's kind of my perspective on it, but I can appreciate other people's perspectives as well.
Right, for sure. And you know, I think you kind of touched on this, but something I wanted to ask you. Let me find it here. Um, so you said Hermes Trismegistus was the first to discover this ancient science.
I mean, I don't think that he was actually the first, but he was definitely considered by the Greeks to basically have such a knowledge of it that they looked at him as an incarnation of their Hermes.
Mm,
He was actually an Egyptian. So the Egyptians, long before the Hellenistic Egyptian period, they had already been practicing various forms of alchemy for a long time. And presumably, this maybe would have even extended into Mesopotamia with lesser advanced versions of it. But their priest class and pharaoh class were super obsessed with it because they saw these reactions as being extremely divine and something that connected them in with the unseen world and mystery in such a way that heretofore at that time had not been experienced. And so for them, it was very much so a religious and sanctimonious and very sacred experience. And by the time Hermes Trismegistus came around, or who the Greeks identify as Hermes Trismegistus, he had such a working understanding of things and such a solid foundation of it that it was almost like second nature to him. So all of these arts had definitely been practiced for a while before he came along, but he culminated them in a way that really made sense. And every so often you get another character like that. Like after the Greeks, you have the Arabs that inherited alchemy, at least in the West. And there was at least one, Al-Jabir, who also had an amazing firm foundational understanding of these things and expounded on the theories so much so that it became just like common knowledge at that time.
okay.
And for hundreds of years thereafter. And then in the European system, it was Paracelsus who did that.
Mm.
And then, you know, we're pretty much due for another one of these today.
Maybe you're at Phoenix.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. The only way to tell these things is see how people talk about you in 400 or 500 years. So
Right, right.
we'll have
We
no
got a
way of
ways to
knowing.
go.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess practical alchemy. So I get the metaphor of turning lead into gold, and you kind of alluded to this already. But from your experience, is this more than just a metaphor? And how does alchemy tie into spirituality?
That's a brilliant question. Yes, it is far more than just a metaphor. And it's not just lead, it's any baser metal can be
Mhm.
transmuted into gold through the creation of what's known as the Philosopher's Stone. And there are multiple routes of going to the Philosopher's Stone by way of lab work. Traditionally, there are at least two different categories to get there. There's called via humida and via secca. Via is VIA. That's Latin for like the way of, and humida means humid or wet. So that's a wet path, which uses solvents and corrosives and things like that in order to get to that path. And then there's also via secca, which means the dry way. And for my part, I'm not very familiar with the wet path way of getting there, but because of Frater Albertus's work and Jean Dubuis's work, I am very familiar with the dry path methods. And all I can say about those really is that, you know, there's two different types of Philosopher's Stone. For realistically, even within the dry path, there's the lunar stone or the white stone, and then there's the solar stone or the stone that's made out of gold. The white stone is made with silver. So you can transmute baser metals into these things. Now, is it an actual technical transmutation or is it a tinging? I think that that could still be debated, and I think that we need to have more alchemists in the modern day. There's 3 of us that I know of that are
Wow.
capable of performing this work definitively, and probably many more that are capable of performing the work, who just, you don't hear about them because it's just their own personal path.
Right.
So, but I know for a fact that there's at least 3 of us here in the United States that are at the level and have enough experience and expertise and have done it wrong enough times to know exactly how to do it right, where we could reproducibly create a substance that could be tested chemically. The problem is, though, is that we're very heavily repressed by primarily by secret societies like the FBI and CIA. The
Mhm.
reason why is because if transmutation of gold was something that could happen, or even of silver,
Right.
it would be heavily destabilizing to the monetary value in global trade systems.
Yeah.
And so even though we're at a point where logistically it's feasible, uh,
Right.
judiciously, it's
It
it's not
scares
very
some
smart.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and I don't mean to pose a threat to the world economic system, because I don't want it to collapse either,
Right.
at least without coming up with a better system that's going to take its place, right? To do so would just be completely unethical. So,
That
I,
that just makes me think, like, back in the ancient times where there were a bunch of people like hoarding gold, like just, transmuting all these base metals into gold and, you know,
kind of, the answer is kind
reselling
of
it.
like, even historically, like in ancient Greece, alchemy wasn't really used so much for medicine. It really didn't start getting used for medicine until the Arab period, actually, which
Hmm.
was about 600 AD. So all the way through Greek history, they would use that knowledge to like tint or tinge baser metals to look like gold, and then adorn their palaces and temples and other things with that. And so they weren't necessarily hoarding it, because it takes so much effort and energy to even make the materials, and time too, like 6+ years. Okay. So it's not like an easy or a very fast process, but they're able to do these things from more of an industrial perspective in order to make, because it's much easier to mine copper than it is to mine gold. Much easier to do, much
Right.
easier to get mercury than it is to mine a whole lot of other metals as well. And so if you can stabilize those things and turn them into colors that are indistinguishable to a metallurgist or even to the common eye, then why would you not do that? It's much cheaper and much more effective in the long run. So yeah, in the past, there are definitely people who have done it. And of course, Nicholas Flamel actually set up an entire graveyard in his name. He set up hospitals that are still around today. He set up lots of different things. And from his own account, he and his wife Perenelle figured out how to make the dry Philosopher's Stone, the red stone, and that's where he acquired his riches. And then he gave all of his riches away, because he viewed it that by the grace of God did he come into that knowledge. And so through it would be a disrespectful thing if he didn't use that for sociological benefit of all of society, not just himself. And I think anybody who actually practices alchemy would view things very much so the same way. Like you have people like, Bezos and, you know, well, any billionaire really, or
Right.
trillionaire or whatever, they collect so much money and they look at it like, oh, I had to work for everything that I had and blah 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 blah, and I already employ all these people and I get plenty of my money away, I want to spend it how I want to spend it. You can tell that they haven't done the internal work that alchemy would cause a person to do, because when you do things like that, you realize that you actually are the other. You
Yeah.
are the person that's suffering. You are the homeless
Yes.
person you just drove past. You are all of these aspects. You are all of nature encompassed. And so By
So
helping others, you do help yourself. And by helping everything, you are helping yourself. And in that way, nothing is necessarily altruistic, but there are goals where by helping out all of these other structures to the best of your capability, you are investing in yourself and in the society that you live in. Any betterment that you make is a good betterment.
I love that, man. And that's what my show's all about is, rising above our differences and duality and, the whole divide and conquer agenda and just, what do we have in common? Like seeing, each other as just divine reflections, and
Yeah.
realizing, what we do to other people affects us just as much. And,
Oh, dude,
it's so important.
it's so important to understand, man. And for me, alchemy has informed my magical practices a lot too, because there are so many people that I know, and it's so common. If you go into any sort of magical group, they'll have like all these memes that are like me when I started, and it's this white witch using like all of these herbs and crystals for healing, versus me now, and it's like this gothic looking witch that's like cursing and hexing people. And I think that that's a natural tendency. Anytime that a person finds power outside of themselves, but doesn't necessarily find the power within themselves, they end up reflexing it in very negative, harmful, and deleterious ways, because that's the only way that they can feel or perceive power, as if they have power over other people. For me, it's power over myself.
Yes.
It's being able to increase my own personal power, my own personal willpower, my own, like, can I defeat the aspects of myself that want to be lazy? Can I defeat
Right.
the aspects of myself that want to be mean spirited, or that want to, do these other things? Because if you can do that, then you have just conquered another layer and shown your true self-worth. And so alchemy was kind of the tasting point for all of that, but the magical practices really got that going. So for me, a lot of my magical practices are all about world betterment, world healing, healing traumas, helping inspire people to also practice things that are going to help heal themselves ancestrally and in the present moment with their own experience in their own lives, their own physicalities, things like that, with the concept of, give a man a fish versus teach a man to fish. My role is, with the greatest magic that I can, how can I have the broadest reach that I can out to other people and teach them how to do this work for themselves, so that they get the experience, not vicariously, but existentially, to better their own lives and the lives of others around them. And it's infectious. One person doing this work will impact dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other people in the course of their lifetime, and inspire them to do better as well. So for me, I think that that's a really important goal, and kind of, what I'm personally centered in on.
I love that so much, brother. And but before I forget, like I told Lindsay Shorman, I had her on not too long ago, and it was a show you and her did together on Tinfoil Hat, I believe. And
Oh yeah.
yeah, I remember you saying something about what you pay attention to versus being aware,
Yeah.
the difference between those. And like, man, I can't tell you how much that helped me through an ayahuasca experience I had, like using that advice and like
Cool.
applying it to that experience. And yeah, man, that's such a important thing just in your everyday life, just keeping a healthy state of mind and mind, body, spirit, oh, so important.
Oh man, it's so important. Yeah, that was a jewel I stumbled upon. And anytime I stumble upon something, I always try and break off a piece and give it to someone else too, because
Right.
it's valuable stuff. Even in homeopathic doses, that's a valuable lesson.
Right. For sure. Yeah, I guess you did that show on IDF reading.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
you care to go into that at all? Just kind
Sure,
of
yeah.
explain what that
So
is.
yeah, intrinsic data fields. That's what IDF stands for, intrinsic data field. And it basically, there's so many ways I could, if we had the time, actually. In fact, I might do a podcast episode on this. It's already come up and people have asked me about it. I could show how every different culture through every different time period has interacted with intrinsic data fields at one point or the other. IDF is not a new technology. It's something that has always been used from the very beginning of time. Even prayer, okay, is a form of impacting intrinsic data fields. When you pray for the health or well-being or peace or anything of another person or a departed one or a loved one or anything, you are impacting the intrinsic data field of the thing that you're praying for. Anytime that you set out a good intention or bad intentions, even any of these things are constantly impacting intrinsic data fields. And basically what an intrinsic data field is that it's intrinsic to a particular thing. And that thing has dozens and dozens and dozens, if not thousands and millions and billions of smaller microcosmic data fields that comprise the entire data field. So like, for instance, as a human organism, you might have the macroscopic field of you as a human individual. And within that field, you can break it down into the spiritual aspect of that field, the causal aspect of the field, the astral, the etheric, the physical aspects of that field. And then if we were to zoom in just into the physical, okay, you have your musculoskeletal system, and that's one field. But then within the musculoskeletal system, you have this particular joint, this particular tendon, this particular bone, this piece of bone marrow, this red blood cell inside of the bone marrow, and microcosmically as far down as you can go. And it really just never stops, right? So intrinsic data fields are holographic and fractal, is basically the most concise way of talking about that. And they have existed for ever since any matter or energy has ever existed, because all it is a field or an emanation of energy and a way of being able to impact it either through thought, behavior, speech, any different energetic way of impacting material. So even, modern day energy healings, like a lot of people today are very familiar with, say, crystal healing or Reiki or whatever, that is impacting, you're sending energy to that person, their aura or their energy field. That's another way of talking about it. And there are other ways of talking about it as well. So typically the instruments that are used these days to consciously interface with electronic equipment in order to be able to dialogue with these intrinsic data fields or to influence these data fields without, shall we say, more manual methods, like, for instance, magic or surgery or whatever else.
Right.
They are known as radionics instruments, or another term for that is really popular and common these days is quantum scalar instruments. And out of all of them that I've ever used, the SE5 2000, it formerly was SE5 1000, is the most versatile and the most advanced instrument that's out there. And so that's what I use. And on these episodes, basically, I would do what are called word tunings, where I ask a question, and then I use a particular type of equipment known as a precision stick detector to be able to divine the answer to that and calibrate it on a numerical scale. So typically, the limitations of the equipment that I'm using right now mean that I have to calibrate something between a scale of 0 to 10,000. I typically use the scale of 0 to 100 as a percentage-based reading. And so anything that can be calibrated numerically between 0 and 10,000, we can use these instruments to be able to do that. So if I say, on a scale of 0 to 100, how likely is it that blank will happen? Then I can take that reading and know that 100 is going to mean very likely, in fact, almost indubiously it will happen. And 0 would mean not very likely at all. In fact, it almost definitely won't happen. Or I can ask yes, no questions with the calibration of 0 to 40, meaning no, with 0 meaning, oh, hell no, and 41 to 70 meaning maybe. And maybes are very elusive. They're hard for us to interpret. And then 71 to 100 meaning yes, with things near 100 meaning, oh, hell yes, and 71 meaning yeah, and, or yeah, but, like that type of thing. So those were some of the episodes. And I do that a lot for my wellness investigations and for clients, and also here in the laboratory all the time. In fact, one of the things that I've started doing since I got this equipment was, asking, per 50 grams of potassium carbonate salt, how many milliliters do I need in order to perform, how many milliliters of water do I need in order to perform a perfect crystallization of the substance? And then I'll divine that answer because that's a numerical answer. And so let's say, like we recently did this week, it tells me 52.3. And so if I say, is it true that between 50 to 55 milliliters is going to allow me to crystallize this amount of, potassium carbonate spagyric salt? And then I calibrate that reading on a 0 to 100. In this case, it came up 100 and it says yes. So I take that information down and then I go into the lab and I actually do it and it works perfect. In fact, more perfectly than my intuition ever has over the nearly 20 years that I've been doing this, which my intuition was pretty damn dialed in the first place. But this is so much more dialed in. Now, when you're using quantum scalar equipment today, there are a lot of different types of interferences that can happen. Negative psychic energy to you, curses, hexes, jinxes, ancestral stuff. Not only that, but just general mental or physiological blockages, confidence things, your own belief systems, not to mention interfering electromagnetic fields or, radio waves or other things like that. And so a lot of people will get this thinking that they can just use it like I am, from the very first day. And it's not like that. I had almost 25 years actually, because I was practicing as a kid, of divination experience before I ever even touched one of these SE5s. And so I had already, calibrated, like even, just right today, every single day carried on my person. I've always got a pendulum,
Oh, wow.
like constantly carrying it, because if I'm away from one of these, I know how to use the very same thing. I can use my pendulum to heal people. I can use my pendulum to divine answers. I can use my pendulum to do lots of things in the same way that I could use, if I don't have my pendulum, kinesiological testing on myself or on other people. And, it's one of those art forms that I think is really important because our subconscious already knows all of the answers to everything. In fact, I practiced hypnosis many years ago and studied with a guy named Ronald Locklear Vinyl. And I studied with a couple of other people too. There's this gal whose name I forget. She owned a business called Wildflower Hypnotherapy. And I learned a lot of stuff through books, but then I've learned a lot of stuff through those guys as well. And one of the things I learned to do is put people into states of hypnosis and then ask them questions that their conscious mind would never know, like how many pounds of copper conduit are running through the walls of the room that I'm sitting in right now. Without fail, people can tell you that answer down to like the most minute amount if you're just specific in the way that you give that command. They already know this information. I've seen it so many times in hypnosis that for me, I'm not trying to use this equipment to access answers outside of myself. In fact, that's the biggest misconception. You always get people when they hear about this, they're like, well, who's answering? It's like, well, nobody's answering. I'm answering. I already know the answer. It's already within my unconscious and subconscious self. So all I'm doing is using a tool to fish that out of my subconscious and bring it to the conscious mind, or as Jung would put it, to make the subconscious conscious.
Yes.
And for me, that is the biggest ramification of it. And that's what I do. But I use this in healing work. We're doing and have been doing clinical studies on a large number of people. We call it IDF wellness research, where basically they come in with all of these mysterious illnesses that no doctors or other people, regardless of the different types of healers or how many of them that they've ever tried to see, they're unable to get these things healed. And then they'll come and see me and I'll work on them and just approach it as systematically as I can and scientifically as I can, with the end goal of, let's try and address this and see if we can eliminate it just using quantum scalar frequencies that are broadcasted to your intrinsic data field. And if so, then that's great. And I have case studies, and then we can take this to the next level where I can train people, which will happen. We're shooting for about February of next year, where I'll start opening up my training to show other people how to do this. So other people will be able to buy the systems from me, buy the training from me and stuff, and then we'll be able to funnel direct clients to them from our academy to be able to scientifically work on people. And the way that I have this set up is kind of as blind study peer review. So I give the same individual without any background knowledge at all about anything except for the symptoms that they're having, and have people run the protocols that I've taught them and see if we can get similar numbers. It'll be the first time that anything even remotely close to that has ever been done within the radionics or sometimes it's called psychotronics community. And
Amazing.
so, yeah, we'll be doing that. And if the answer comes back as yes, then we can submit those peer review cases to doctors and other things that want to publish the data and actually do clinical trials in a very rigorous scientific way, so that we can maybe begin to change the way that the modern medical system looks at things, from just this very Newtonian biomechanical view to a much more quantum and energetic view. And where those two meet eye to eye, I think is going to be the sweet spot of medicine. And that's been a vision of mine and a goal of mine for a long time. I'm very passionate about healing in all of its forms, psychologically, spiritually, physically. And so for me, this is kind of like the end goal. If I only accomplish one thing by the end of my life, it will be this type of data. So
So fascinating, brother. And it brought up something for me. I had a past life regression hypnosis done, and I totally know what you mean as far as like, you know, making the subconscious conscious, or like, stuff comes out of you that you would never expect, or
yeah,
like I didn't know that. How the hell, like, where did this come from? And like, the stuff
dude,
it revealed to me, I had no idea where it came from. Like,
exactly. It's like even in your wildest conscious imagination, you couldn't have just drawn that up. It just
right.
like, whoa, where did that come from? And then, but it lends understanding
Yeah.
to things that, patterns that are happening or playing out regularly, or inherent talents or interests or whatever else that are already there. It's, I've seen so many cases of that it's just undeniable for me. And I think that people who are skeptical about it should be skeptical about it, because I
Right.
always have been. I always have to second guess,
Same.
like, did I just experience that? What the hell?
Right.
But at the same time, they have to be open to seeing enough of those cases, not just looking at one thing and then dismissing it, being like,
Yeah.
it could be bullshit. It's like, well, of course anything could be.
You can't
But
just turn a blind eye to it. Yeah.
yeah, if you really want to have an opinion on it, you have to review it over and over and over and over and over to see if you're getting similar experiences. And if you are, you don't have to say, oh, I believe that it's happening because of this, because it's too premature to even know that. It's just, there's something to this.
Right.
And if you're curious enough, like I am, then you say, why?
Right.
Why is this happening? Let me find that
Yep.
out.
I love it, brother. I love it. So I guess there's one thing I wanted to dive in here as we get towards the tail end. So let's talk some magic. Black magic versus white magic. How do you apply magic to your everyday life? I guess, what are the major differences between those, or is
Sure.
there?
So, I guess you could consider it to, I mean, there is a common phrase that is very popular these days that say that, cursing and healing are two sides of the same token.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that that's true about most people's lives as well. So, for instance, you might get one person who develops a trauma who then realizes how other people feel, and then they try and dedicate their whole lives to healing other people, even if they're still wounded themselves, to healing other people or preventing that trauma from happening. And then there are people who get traumatized who then end up traumatizing other people in the same way that they were traumatized. That trauma really is the token, and there's two different ways that people can technically respond to that trauma, either by preventing it, sheltering, healing, etc., or by perpetuating and being more deleterious. The same is true really with magic, and it really is just kind of a personal path and a personal preference as to how a person goes. The way that I view things, there really is no right way or wrong way of approaching things. But also within that, for me, it's a lot about ethics, and it's a
Mm,
lot about what do I want to have perpetuated? Do I want to have a lot of traumatic or traumatized people, or people who can't get their shit together because they've been harmed, cursed, jinxed, etc., in my society? Or if they wrong me, would I rather help heal the things that led them to performing that wrong against me? For me, the answer is definitely the latter. I want to help heal other people, and I want to try to the best way that I can to try and understand what would have led them to that in the first place. But that's a personal thing. Magic is just a principle, which is to say what you put out is ultimately what you end up experiencing. And so, there's tons of different pathways of magic, even just beyond black and white, these basic reflexes. Like, for
right.
instance, I myself am of the Druid tradition. I'm a member of the Dune Moor Druid Order based out of Colorado. I have also studied with John Michael Greer, all of his books and texts. I've been studying with Douglas Monroe since I was 8 years old from his texts. So I'm very heavily inspired by what we could refer to as green magic or earth magic, where we're utilizing herbs and crystals and other natural components of the earth in order to amplify intentions that we already have. And we understand that they already have a certain resonance to them that lend to what our intention is already. And so it's a very consensual form of being able to utilize things that are already looking to do, or already have this type of healing energy or component to lend to our intentions of making it happen. But I also practice what we would refer to as hedge witchery, which is finding out more about those liminal spaces of consciousness, especially between life and death. What happens before you're born, what happens after you're dead,
Mm,
and also what happens in altered states of consciousness, such as psychedelic experiences and ayahuasca and other, what would be more considered to be shamanic liminal experiences today. I also practice lots of other forms of magic, and have learned even others, like Enochian and angelic / Clifothic magic, and the theurgy, which is, kind of falls into that same category, and all these other different types. Sigil magic, folk magic is actually probably some of my favorite. Right now, I'm really nuts deep in studying Appalachian folk magic. Um, so yeah, like there's just so many varieties, but realistically, people are already using magic anyway without
right.
even recognizing that that's what it is. Again, it's just making the subconscious things that you do conscious that lend to the potency of them in order to make the most efficacious actions, speech, or behaviors and thoughts that you possibly can to support you and whatever your intention is. If you're a very self-centered person and very selfish and also hurt and acting from a dark space, then more likely you're going to be drawn towards the darker aspects of magic, because you want the riches for yourself, or you want the control, you want the power, you want all these things. That's going to be what you're already leading yourself towards, whether you're consciously practicing dark magic or not. You're still practicing it.
Right.
And on the other hand, if you want to better yourself and better society and better all these other things, those are your intentions anyway. You may as well learn how to make those intentions far more potent so that you can actually manifest or realize, which is to say, to actually make something real within your life, instead of just making it this very ethereal type idea or intention that seems very far-fetched. So yeah, that would kind of be my general answer on that. And again, I don't demonize anybody who practices any form of magic.
Right.
I think that it's just a force, and it takes all types. We're all here, like, you can't really have day without night. You can't have light without darkness. You can't have all these
Right.
other things. So, and everybody's got their personal path. I don't really know. Nobody knows where everybody is at in their own evolutionary timeline. Some people might be on a descending evolutionary scale, while others are on an ascending evolutionary scale. So it's just important to realize what you want as an individual and where you fit into the cosmic harmony of things, and to have that awareness as you act consciously to bring things about. And I always just consider thinking about the ethics of things, and thinking about what it is that you really, really want. Like, honestly, if you don't care at all about society or other people or anything, and you've tried and you you still don't want to, then that probably means that you are just one of those forces inside of our world that are there to hold the balance against other people that do. And
Mm,
it's all about balance. Right now, I think that things are very imbalanced and they're going in a very dark direction.
right.
This is partially part of the astronomical cycle that will lead us to a better space in the long run. And sometimes we just have to go through this collectively on an evolutionary cycle in order to get to the realizations of what we actually want. So again, I just do what I do because I feel that that's that it's important, and I'm trying to hold a balance, but not trying to browbeat, so to speak, my will or my agenda of what I think needs to be in the world, um, upon the world. It's
Right.
just trying to inspire others that feel the same way that I do to do that, so that they can help hold the balance to some of these darker themes that are pervasive, like, abuse and degradation, greed, fear, depredation, things like that.
Right, man. And like, growing up in the church and stuff, like so much of like these occult practices are so demonized. And,
Oh
it's
yeah.
like we always like create this boogeyman until we see that, it's just a fluffy teddy bear. Like, like until we've actually experienced it ourselves, like who are we to say like that's wrong or that's evil? Like, and like you said, most people are already doing this stuff unconsciously. And
Yeah.
it's just fascinating to me. I'm still dipping my toes into this stuff, but
Yeah.
you're piquing my interest this whole last hour talking to you.
Well, it's like this. First of all, just about any church will demonize magic or witchcraft of any sort, but in the
Right.
same breath, they will offer you a blessing in the name of Jesus Christ and like cast out demons. And,
Right.
like, especially within the Catholic Church, like the entire exorcism thing, or even the sprinkling of holy water, being baptized with a baptismal
Right.
candle and a baptismal font, like you're using elemental magic.
100%.
Like
It's ironic.
yeah, it's like that's what this is. So
Yep.
for them to be actually utilizing magic and hypnosis, FYI,
Right.
constantly, and not acknowledge that any other form exists, is actually, to me, just a form of gaslighting. And it
Oh yeah.
is actually a dark magical practice as a result of that, because and by dark, it's just, it, not all of it means that it's bad. It means that it's obfuscating what is actually happening. It, like, is casting shadows, so to speak, so that people
Yeah.
don't see the actual figure that is moving, the puppeteer, so to speak. They just see the
Mhm.
shadow figure on the wall. Um,
Like Plato's cave.
yeah, exactly. So that's a big thing. And the same thing too, like with just your common, moms, when they prepare a meal out of love and it helps to heal the family. Like, I don't know about you, but anytime I got sick, my mom was making homemade chicken noodle soup from scratch, egg noodles, the whole 9 yards. Like, that always helped me heal.
Yeah.
Part of that can be ascribed to the physiological ingredients that are in there, but a lot of it too is the quantum force of love that was put into there, the devotion, the desire, and the intention to help
Mhm.
heal her son. And therefore, as I'm the recipient of that, that energy impacts my intrinsic data field, and it helps me to get better on ways that are also important to healing besides just the physiological component. And so people are already always, no matter what they do, no matter what they say, they are using magic. What you say, what you look at, the way that you think, and what you do as an actual action, every action is a ritual that programs your subconscious for the likelihood of what is to come next in your life.
I
And
love it.
if you can understand that one single principle, you can begin living a magical existence very easily.
I love that so much, brother. I guess one last question here to end it. Let's see. So I guess with all the craziness going on in the world, or at least prospectively speaking, you shut off the TV, the world's a lot less crazy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take a walk out in the woods. But what are some of your daily practices that just kind of help keep you grounded throughout these times? I guess spiritually
Well,
speaking.
yeah, so I do these practices that are loosely based on some martial arts practices that I learned that originated in Indonesia called Merpati Putih.
Okay.
It's a breathing and a physical exercise that kind of unites spirit and soul and body all in one type of thing. And it's usually just like a quick 3 to 5 minute movement with that incorporates meditation and movement and breathing all in one. That to me
is that similar to Tai Chi then?
is very similar. Yeah, it's like a different regional take on it, but
Gotcha.
that's
Okay.
kind of what I do. It's called Pembinan.
Okay.
And I have my own way of performing it over the years that is more suited towards elemental magic than it was the way that I initially learned it. But yeah, that's a big thing. And then of course, like I would have to say, like my biggest form of spirituality is the way that I think, act, and speak throughout the day. Trying to speak in positive ways, trying to use really good discernment about what is actually true and what is not actually true, and whether something can be actually objectively true or not. Also, just trying to observe the difference in my thoughts. Like, for instance, when I speak, act, or behave in a particular way, or think in a particular way, just asking myself, is this me consciously choosing this, or is this just some sort of inherent behavior, thought, or word that I have been trained somewhere along the line to say? Is it authentically me? Am I choosing this, or is it just what's happening? Because if it's just what's happening, it probably means that's my ancestors speaking through me, ancestral trauma, lineage, inherent training and programming that it doesn't even really originate with me or my own conscious choice. But once I can acknowledge it as that, then I can treat it as something external from me and dialogue with it. Because if it is an ancestral entity or even impulse, then I can understand it, I can work with it, I can help to heal that and become more of myself throughout the day. But yeah, I think it's really important to turn off news. Like you will do so much better. This is true for everybody. You will do so much better if you don't know what's going on outside of you. If you just focus on what's going on inside of you and turn your attention inwards, then you'll have a much greater success at being the person and doing the things that actually fulfill you within the course of your lifetime. If you watch other people and fill your head full of what they are telling you, then you will always be in a state of fear, and it's easy to hijack you as an individual. So yeah, that would be the thing that I do the most, I guess, would be just reflection on where do I start and where do I stop, and focusing on my own internal energy. And that's like a constant practice. Has been for years, and it probably will be until I die. So
the work is never done, brother.
the work is never done. No matter how much we know today, tomorrow a deeper embrace can always be had.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Phoenix. This has been a blast, man. I think the listeners are going to love this one. And I guess if you want to tell the listeners where they can find your work and, what you're up to or got coming up in the near future.
Sure. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've got a lot of things coming up in the near future. Some classes, some courses, some public offerings, all sorts of stuff. But the very best way to stay up to date with everything that we're doing is just join our mailing list. We got rid of all of our social media months and months and months ago. It feels like years now. It could actually be years. I haven't even kept track of it. So even though you may find our profiles on there, like if you were to scroll, like it's super, super, super rare that we have posted anything at all, personally or otherwise, for a very long time. So just going to our website, phoenixaurelius.org, and signing up to be part of our email newsletter list every month on the 5th of the month, or if the 5th is like on a Sunday or something, then sometimes we'll do it on the 6th. But yeah, we send out an email newsletter with a laboratory update of everything that we did that prior month. So like this is going to be September, so we'll have a lab report for the month of August, letting people know what we did here at the Research Society, also new and upcoming things, stuff like that. The best way to support myself and my research, if you really vibe with my mission and want something to benefit yourself too, would be to purchase stuff from my spagyric apothecary or schedule a consultation with me, because those things help to directly fund my research and keep my work going. And so, yeah, that's kind of a big thing. And then, of course, you know, I offer a bunch of different types of classes and other stuff like that from time to time. I've got a great teachable course that is probably the most thorough I've ever seen. It will save you 15 to 20 years of experience in terms of actually making spagyric tinctures. And we've got more courses that are already filmed that, you know, I keep threatening. They've been filmed for almost a year now. I keep threatening like, oh, I'll finish all of the text, but it takes a long time for me to sit down and actually write things out. So they'll be done sometime.
You're
Don't
getting
know
there.
when, but yeah. So again, if you're part of our email newsletter, you'll stay tuned to all of those things as they become available, though.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for listening, and have a great week. Peace and love.